The night Moscow went silent, three young sisters sat in a dimly lit apartment, staring at the man they once called father. Outside, the city glowed with life, but inside that home, hell had found its permanent address. For years, their screams never reached beyond those walls, drowned by the sound of their father's voice, a voice that commanded fear and demanded silence. But that night, silence broke. That night, the world would hear them, not as victims, but as survivors of something far darker than death. It began like any other night. The same routine, the same terror. The girls had learned to predict his moods by the way he shut the door, by the sound of his footsteps. But that evening, something in their hearts had changed. The fear that once chained them was slowly turning into something else: desperation, defiance, and the unbearable weight of survival. They weren't planning murder. They were planning to live. And as the clock struck midnight, destiny crept into that room, silent and cold. This is not a story about killers. It's a story about endurance, about the breaking point of the human soul. What happens when pain becomes louder than morality? When survival itself turns into a sin? This is the haunting case of the Khachaturian sisters, three daughters who faced their father's wrath and the world's judgment. To outsiders, Mikhail Khachaturian was a respectable man, religious, disciplined, authoritative. But behind closed doors, his home was a prison. His daughters lived under rules no child should ever know. He decided when they could speak, when they could eat, even when they could breathe. There were cameras in every room, watching their every move. Fear had become their language, silence their only friend. The neighbors heard nothing. The city outside moved on, unaware of the nightmare growing inside that small apartment. Every night followed a pattern: obedience, correction, punishment. His rage was unpredictable, his words venomous. He believed he owned them, body and soul. For years the sisters endured, praying that someone would notice, that someone would help. But no one ever came. Authorities ignored their quiet cries, schools didn't ask, and relatives stayed silent. Monsters, they realized, didn't always hide under beds. Sometimes they sat at the family dinner table. Christina, the eldest, tried to protect her younger sisters. She'd whisper at night, "One day, this will end. Just hold on." But deep down she was losing hope. Every bruise, every insult, every night made her wonder, was there any way out? Because in their home there were no locked doors, only locked lives. The night it happened, the air was thick with dread. He came home drunk, angrier than usual, his voice echoing through the hall like thunder. The girls froze. They had seen that look before, the kind that promised pain. He started shouting, accusing, breaking things. Each word was a whip, each movement a storm. The sisters hid in their room, trembling, whispering prayers that went unanswered. Then the door burst open. The man who was supposed to protect them became the monster who destroyed them. In that moment, something inside the eldest sister snapped. The years of abuse, the endless fear, it all crashed into one terrifying truth. If they didn't act now, they wouldn't live to see another sunrise. The line between fear and courage blurred into one desperate act of survival. The screams that followed were not of hatred, but of pain, of years being released in a single violent moment. When silence finally returned, the air smelled of iron, of finality. The sisters stood trembling, staring at the man who had ruled their lives lying motionless on the floor. It was over, but in that moment, they had no idea what kind of storm they had just unleashed. The apartment was quiet, eerily quiet. The sisters sat together, covered in tears and terror. The weight of what they'd done crushed them. They weren't killers. They were broken children who had been pushed too far. Their hands shook as they tried to call for help, but no words would come out. The phone slipped, the air grew colder, and time stood still. When the police arrived, the scene was confusion and shock. The officers found 3 trembling girls who couldn't stop crying. Their father's body lay in the next room, and the horror of the situation spread through the building like wildfire. Within hours, news vans surrounded the building. Cameras flashed, voices shouted. The sisters' faces, pale and blank, became the face of a nation's darkest question. Were they murderers or victims of a system that failed them? At the police station, they confessed everything. Not with pride, but with trembling voices and endless tears. Each word was soaked in guilt and fear. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked for understanding. But as the headlines grew bolder, sympathy began to split. Half the world saw monsters. The other half saw survivors. In the cold interrogation room, the light buzzed overhead. The girls sat close together, afraid even to breathe. The officers' questions were harsh. Why didn't you run? Why didn't you tell someone? They didn't understand that for years, running wasn't an option. Their father had eyes everywhere, threats for every breath of disobedience. To escape meant to die, Christina answered softly, her voice shaking. She told them about the abuse, the threats, the cameras, about nights without sleep, about the endless fear that had hollowed their souls. The officers looked stunned, some disbelieving, others silent. It was a story too cruel to imagine, but too detailed to deny. For hours they spoke, recounting horrors that no one had ever believed before. When the confession ended, the sisters broke down completely. Their bodies trembled, their voices cracked, and for the first time in years they were free to cry. Not because of what they had done, but because they finally had the right to speak. The story exploded across Russia and the world. Every headline screamed the same thing. 3 sisters killed their father. But soon the narrative began to shift. As details of abuse surfaced, people started asking different questions. What if this wasn't murder? What if it was survival? Talk shows debated their morality. News anchors called them symbols of a broken system. Some called them heroes, others sinners. The world divided into 2 camps, those who saw vengeance and those who saw liberation. Every image of their tear-streaked faces deepened the public's obsession. Their story wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about thousands of hidden homes filled with silent suffering. Protests began in Moscow. Women held posters that read, "We could be them." It was no longer about 3 sisters. It was about every woman trapped behind closed doors, waiting for someone to listen. Inside the courtroom, stacks of files, photos, and medical reports painted a horror story. Years of bruises, doctor visits, and silent complaints that were ignored. The evidence didn't lie. Psychologists confirmed long-term trauma. Videos from inside their home showed control so suffocating it made even the hardest hearts tremble. As the defense presented their case, the courtroom grew silent. People finally saw the truth. 3 girls who had begged for help that never came. A father who had turned his home into a cage. And a society that had chosen not to look. The prosecutor's voice wavered, his arguments suddenly hollow. By the time the session ended, the courtroom no longer saw criminals sitting in that glass box. They saw survivors, and the real question became, who was truly guilty? The girls who fought back or the world that let it happen? Weeks turned into months. The courtroom became a battlefield between morality and law. Activists filled the hallways, chanting for justice, while others whispered that a crime was still a crime. The sisters sat quietly, their faces pale, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights. They weren't fighting for fame, they were fighting for freedom. Each hearing felt like reliving the same nightmare. Lawyers spoke in circles, reporters scribbled notes, and the sisters waited in silence. The weight of judgment hung heavy, and even the judge seemed torn between justice and empathy. The world outside debated, but inside, it was just 3 girls and a lifetime of fear. Every day they prayed, not for forgiveness, but for someone to understand that survival sometimes demands impossible choices. Protests erupted across the country. Thousands of people marched through the streets with candles and signs. "Freedom for the Khachaturian sisters," they chanted, their voices echoing through Moscow's cold streets. For the first time, society began to question its silence. Journalists wrote essays, psychologists spoke on television, and people shared their own stories of abuse. The sisters had started a revolution, not with words, but with pain. Their suffering became a mirror that forced everyone to see what they had ignored for too long. They were no longer just three sisters on trial. They were the voice of every woman who had ever been told to stay quiet, to endure, to obey. And that voice could no longer be silenced. Snow fell outside the courthouse the morning of the final verdict. The world watched as the judge entered, papers trembling in his hand. The sisters held each other's hands tightly, hearts pounding. The air was thick, every second stretching into eternity. The judge's voice broke through the silence, calm but heavy. He acknowledged the abuse, the trauma, the years of suffering that had led to that terrible night. And then he said the words that would change everything. Not guilty of murder. Acted in self-defense. Gasps filled the room. Tears flowed freely, some in joy, others in disbelief. The sisters collapsed into each other's arms, crying not from victory, but from release. They had been freed, not from the system, but from the darkness that had defined their lives. Freedom didn't erase the past. It only gave them a chance to start again. The sisters began new lives, slowly, quietly, learning to live in a world that once terrified them. Therapy sessions replaced interrogation rooms. Laughter began to replace screams, and hope, fragile but real, returned to their eyes. Their case changed Russia forever. Laws began to shift, awareness spread, and victims across the nation finally found the courage to speak. The Khachaturian sisters had become more than survivors. They had become symbols of strength, of truth, of resilience. And as the world moved on, their story remained, a warning, a reminder, a whisper to all those still suffering in silence. This was not a tale of crime. It was a cry for help the world finally heard. The story of the Khachaturian sisters isn't about death. It's about survival, courage, and the unbearable price of freedom. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to the channel to hear more real stories that reveal the darkness we ignore. Share this story to give a voice to the voiceless. Because sometimes the most powerful act in the world is simply believing someone's pain. Stay aware. Stay human.